very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It is a huge honor and pleasure to be here. I'm an enormous fan of Acumen and really what it represents and what it has been able to do. Really a transformational organization that I think people will study in the years ahead. But let me say I was also so thrilled to hear from the lady before me talking about what she is doing and what she has been able to accomplish. Because it just brought back to me again what it was like growing up in India in the 1960s and 70s, a very different world. Mostly and most importantly, India is a poor country now. It was a poor country then, but mostly how cut off it was from the world. You grew up in an environment where there were high tariff barriers, capital controls on currency, and intellectually, there was a kind of self-contained world in which you didn't really participate. Now, for those of us growing up, we were all looking outside and trying desperately to connect, but it wasn't very easy. I was 10 years old when television came to India. One channel, 4 hours a day, 3.5 hours of which they would show documentaries about the glories of Indian agriculture. And then on Sundays, they would show one Bollywood movie and precede it, and this will tell you how much hard currency India had in 1977. You would precede it with one episode of I Love Lucy, which is all Indian TV could afford at that time. And so our vision into America was sort of limited, and then you began to see the changes that have transformed the world. And the first one really was the kind of technological change. So you began to have videotapes, which allowed you to bring in what was going on American television and see what was going on. Now, of course, none of these videotapes were legal or, or they were all pirated copies. But the great thing about Indians is there's always somebody, some Indian had some relative living in Edison, New Jersey, who could tape the show that you were interested in. And so we would get these bootleg copies of American television shows. And it was almost like, you know how in the Soviet Union they used to pass around dissident literature. They called it samizdat literature, one person to another, and they would make copies, and you would always say, well, make sure the copies don't get too blurry. We did that with videotapes, and so you'd always be trying to get the first couple of copies of the videotape. And so for me, my sort of introduction into America, and every immigrant in a way has a story of the American dream, was the opening sequence of Dallas. For those of you who remember it, this fantastic montage of gleaming buildings, skyscrapers, glass and steel, helicopters landing on their Cadillac cars, men in 10-gallon hats coming out of them, and the women, of course. Victoria Principal, definitely part of my American dream. Yeah, for the young ones, Google her, trust me. But what you saw more than anything else was this sense of optimism and energy and vitality. And it was really set against a very different background in India. This is now, I'm talking India in the mid-1970s. There was an emergency, which was essentially martial law. It had been preceded by the worst inflation, food riots in India, and a very deep sense that India was going nowhere. That's why, about 3,000 people graduate from the IITs every year. In my year, when I graduated from high school and was going into college, the entering class of the IITs, of those 3,000 people, the Times of India did a survey. Within 10 years, 98% of those people were in the United States. So it gave you a sense of how people felt, really that there was nothing that they could do in India, that their only option, their only ambition was outside. We now live in a world transformed. I mean, that's the really central part that I think we sometimes forget, the central trend of our times that we forget, which is that over the last 20, 25 years, you have had a complete transformation of the global system. Those walls have come down. The tariff walls, the currency walls, the capital walls, but most importantly, the intellectual walls. The desire to try to understand, to learn, to know has dramatically transformed the world. And this trend that I see as one of the great positive drivers of change in the world is frankly much more important than all the violence and bombs and IEDs that you read about every day or watch on television. Because this is what is truly transforming the world. And you can see it in the data. If you look at the world in 1979, the number of countries that were growing at 3% a year, robust growth, was about 31, 32. The number of countries growing at 3% a year or more in 2007, before the financial crisis, was 124. Even today, about 85 to 90 countries are growing at 3% a year or more. In other words, you have tripled the number of countries that are successfully participating in the global system. You see it in the data when you look at the UN's Millennium Development Goals. When those goals were formulated, many people thought this was the usual kind of, pie in the sky rhetoric, hoping to eliminate poverty, etc. The remarkable thing is that the central goal that the UN set, which was that the number of people who lived in extreme poverty, under $1.25 a day, would halve, was reached 5 years ahead of schedule. Now, this is largely because huge countries like China and to a lesser extent India, but the trend lines that produce this really dramatic transformation are true everywhere that you look around the world. Everywhere you look around the world, you have seen some significant progress. You see it, for example, in child mortality data. There is not a single country in the world where child mortality data is the same or worse than it was 10 years ago. Everywhere it has improved. You see this in potable water, a huge and very important positive index for countries moving forward. Everywhere in the world, you are seeing increased access to potable water, which is in many ways at the absolute core of the ability to extend people's lives, to reduce childhood mortality, to improve quality of living. So this transformation, which has taken place because of globalization, because of the information revolution, but also, as I say, because of really a transformation in mentality, is so significant in trying to understand what is going on in the world. If you focus on the negative, God knows the world is awash in people talking about negativism. You have the Middle East imploding. You have stagnation in Europe. You have dysfunction in the United States. And all of that is true in its own way. But the central reality of the world we live in is that after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of very little movement for the vast majority of people in the world, in the last 10 to 15 years, you are seeing dramatic improvements. Those numbers that I described with the UN, the number of people living under extreme poverty being halved, is essentially better in the last 10 years than it was in the preceding 100. In other words, you have taken more people out of poverty in the last 10 years than you did in the preceding 100 years. And these trends are only likely to accelerate because you have this extraordinary power of globalization, the extraordinary power of information technology, both working for you. If you looked at the chart that was up there, you see how much of that was based on the ability to use technology, the ability to use high-scale analytics. And these things are becoming widespread and commonly used. The great transformation that is going to take place in India in the next 5 years is that India is going to go online. Most people don't realize it hasn't really gone online because India has crappy infrastructure. And so unless you were living in a big city and part of the middle class or the upper middle class, you did not really have access to the internet and everything that means. Well, now you have smartphones selling for $35 to $40 a piece, and you're going to go from about 150 million people connected to the internet in India, which is what the current estimate is, to about 750 million people connected in the next 4 years. And this is not much of a prediction. It's happening on a weekly basis. These numbers do add up, which means that you're going to have a group of people larger than the entire population of Europe who are going to have access to the internet in the next 5 to 6 years. If you think about what is at root, in explaining this transformation, I would argue it is the diffusion of knowledge. What's happened is, if you think about what the world was like when I was growing up, you had Western societies, you had communist societies, you had this huge geopolitical, geoeconomic, but ideological struggle at the heart of it, which meant that it was very difficult for people to learn from each other, to accept best practices, because there were all these ideological barriers to understanding practically how do you make a country grow? How do you alleviate poverty? How do you do all these kinds of things? And the collapse of the Berlin Wall helped in that process immeasurably because everyone was now trying to figure out how to play the same game, how to grow, how to raise your standards of living. But in particular, in the area that Acumen has been so active, this is even more true. So there has been this huge debate that has been gone on for decades and decades about the value of foreign aid and the value of foreign assistance. And it has tended to divide people on partisan lines. People who were free market oriented tended to think it was all a waste. People who were more liberal would tend to think, no, we need to double or triple aid. And instead of that, what has happened is you have had a very interesting transformation of the debate where people have come together and said, let us just try to figure out how to make this work. And it's happened, frankly, because of a lot of card-carrying capitalists have decided that they wanted to get in on this game. And they wanted to figure out how to make this work. Bill Gates is perhaps the best example, but there are hundreds and hundreds of people like this who felt to themselves, look, I believe in markets, I believe in individual rights, but I also don't believe in wasting money. I also believe in doing this in a smart way, and I believe in setting up a self-sustaining mechanism and self-sustaining enterprises that will really transform these countries and these economies. And that process has produced a circumstance where for the first time, governments and aid agencies and international organizations and the private sector are all aligned in the same direction, moving in the same way. Anyone who's close to this and very close to it knows that what I'm describing is not the day-to-day reality, and there's a lot of politics and there's a lot of bureaucracy, but at a broad level intellectually, there really has been a much broader alignment of interests that has taken place. And as a result of that, you are seeing best practices begin to flourish and flow. So David Cameron's point man on international aid said, one of the most rewarding things for them has been that we really do know what works. And the question now becomes, how do you implement it best? And that's very different from the world that we used to live in, where you had intense, constant ideological debates on these subjects. I find that when you go now to countries in Africa, in poorer parts of Asia, in Latin America, what is striking is the diffusion of knowledge. You talk to the central banker, or the deputy central banker, or the finance minister, the deputy finance minister, almost anyone there will have some connection to a Western academic institution. They've gone to Georgetown or Chicago or Harvard or someplace like that, and they have imbibed a certain, a set of analytic tools that they are using to try to figure out how to grow their economy, how to reduce poverty, how to adopt and adapt to best practices around the world. That spread of knowledge is ultimately the most powerful thing in the world. Victor Hugo once said, you can resist invading armies, you cannot resist invading ideas. And what has happened is we have now produced enough of these ideas about how to reduce poverty, how to empower women, how to provide capital, seed capital, so that local entrepreneurs can go on to do things, that you have achieved a critical mass that I believe is not going to stop. So when people look at the emerging market world today, they look at the fact that China is slowing down and India has, it remains, troubled and muddied and dysfunctional, which I, by the way, believe will always be true. For those who wonder why, look at America, right? It's a troubled and muddied and dysfunctional democracy. It's the nature of big, open, diverse societies. But what you do see in all of that is this incredible bottom-up energy. And I think that sometimes you have to recognize that that's really what changes the world. It's not the top-down 5-year plans and 10-year plans. It's the kinds of people you're hearing from today. It's the fact that they exist and that thousands and thousands of them exist. And they are changing the world bottom-up. And that transformation means that I would suggest that what you're going to see is an extraordinary next decade where these things happen. But my final point, now that I've painted this Pollyannish picture of the world, is it doesn't happen by itself. This is not some kind of self-sustaining set of great structural forces that are going to happen like the wind blowing. This happens only because people like you, people like Jacqueline are doing the kind of work that allows us to harness the technology, harness this information revolution, harness this consensus, this emerging consensus that has taken place, and do something with it and execute. So it's very important to remember, if you sit back and expect the world's great structural forces to work themselves out, they won't. They only do so because there are people out there actively pushing and determinedly trying to make sure that it happens. And in doing that, what you do is you achieve the kind of sweet spot that I believe Acumen has achieved, where you are taking advantage of and riding on some of the great positive trends in the world, but you are doing it in an innovative way and an effective way that ensures that the legacy will be something much larger and much broader than any of you in the room can possibly imagine. Thank you all very much.